The message arrived on a Tuesday morning when most of the galaxy was still sleeping. Ambassador David Reed was drinking his coffee in the small kitchen of the human embassy when the emergency alert chimed through his personal communicator. The sound was different from the usual diplomatic requests or trade negotiations. This was the deep, urgent tone reserved for matters that could change the course of history. David set down his cup and activated the holographic display above his desk. The three-dimensional image that materialized showed the official seal of the Galactic Council, followed by a formal summons written in the flowing script of High Counselor Thane. The message was brief but carried the weight of authority that could move fleets and topple governments. Ambassador Reed of the Terran Federation, you are hereby commanded to appear before the full Galactic Council in 3 standard days to answer for humanity's recent actions in the Rigel sector. Failure to comply will result in immediate sanctions against all human territories. David read the message twice, his expression growing more thoughtful with each word. The incident at Rigel had been inevitable. For months, human intelligence services had been documenting atrocities committed by the Hegemony Research Division. Sentient beings from dozens of species had been captured and subjected to experiments that violated every principle of civilized space. When the formal complaints filed through proper channels were ignored for the 3rd consecutive time, humanity had acted. The operation had been swift and precise. 3 human destroyers had appeared at the research station without warning, disabled its defenses, and evacuated every prisoner they could find. The station itself had been reduced to scrap metal within minutes, its research data purged from existence. To the outside observer, it might have seemed like unprovoked aggression. To those who knew the truth, it was long overdue justice. David walked to his window and looked out at the sprawling city of New Geneva, the diplomatic capital of neutral space. Thousands of species called this place home, their diverse architectures creating a skyline that defied conventional physics. Floating spires shared space with crystal groves and living buildings that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely dependent on the idea that civilized beings could resolve their differences through negotiation rather than violence. That idea was about to be tested in ways that few could imagine. The journey to the Galactic Council chambers took 2 days through hyperspace, giving David plenty of time to review the intelligence reports that had prompted humanity's action at Rigel, the files made for disturbing reading. Neural extraction procedures performed on conscious subjects. Consciousness transfer experiments that left the donors as empty shells. Memory implantation techniques that could rewrite a being's entire personality. The hegemony had been treating sentient life as raw material for their research, and the rest of the galaxy had chosen to look the other way. When David's transport finally docked with the massive space station that housed the Galactic Council, he was met by a delegation of security officers from multiple species. Their escort was professional but tense, as if they expected the human ambassador to produce weapons from thin air and begin shooting. The reputation of human military efficiency had grown considerably in recent years, often in ways that made other species uncomfortable. The council chambers were a marvel of engineering and diplomacy. The vast spherical room could accommodate thousands of different atmospheric requirements simultaneously, allowing species that breathed methane to share space with those who required liquid nitrogen to survive. Hundreds of platforms floated at different levels throughout the sphere, each one customized for the specific needs of its occupant. At the center of it all, a single platform waited for the human representative. David walked across the bridge to his assigned position, ignoring the whispers and pointed comments from the assembled delegates. Many of these beings had never seen a human in person before. To them, humanity was still a young species, barely 2 centuries into their expansion beyond their home system. The fact that these newcomers had grown powerful enough to challenge the established order was a source of considerable anxiety among the older civilizations. High Counselor Thane called the session to order with a gesture of his 4 arms. The insectoid being had ruled the council for over a century, his compound eyes reflecting the wisdom of age and the authority of absolute power. When he spoke, his words were automatically translated into hundreds of languages and broadcast throughout known space. "We gather today to address a serious breach of galactic law," Thane announced, his mandibles clicking with displeasure. "The human species has violated the sovereign territory of the hegemony and destroyed a legitimate research facility. This act of unprovoked aggression cannot be allowed to stand without consequences." David remained silent as the formal charges were. Read. Violation of territorial sovereignty. Destruction of civilian infrastructure, theft of classified research materials. The list went on for several minutes, each accusation carrying penalties that could cripple human expansion for generations. When the reading finally concluded, Thane fixed his compound gaze on the human ambassador. "How do you answer these charges, Ambassador Reed?" David stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that had become his trademark during diplomatic negotiations. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems, reaching every delegate regardless of their position in the sphere. "Honorable counselors, I answer with the truth. The facility in question was not conducting legitimate research. It was a torture chamber where sentient beings were subjected to procedures that violate every treaty governing the treatment of prisoners and experimental subjects. We have documented evidence of these crimes, evidence that was presented to this very council on multiple occasions over the past 3 years." A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates. Several shifted uncomfortably on their platforms, aware that their own governments had received copies of the evidence and chosen to ignore it for political convenience. "The proper channels for addressing such concerns exist for a reason," interjected Counselor Vera, a serpentine being whose scales shifted colors with her emotional state. "Your species cannot simply decide to take military action whenever you disagree with the policies of other governments." David nodded respectfully. "Under normal circumstances, I would agree completely. However, these were not normal circumstances. Every day that facility remained operational, more sentient beings suffered and died. How many lives were we supposed to sacrifice while waiting for diplomatic solutions that never came?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David could see the discomfort it caused among the delegates, many of whom had been aware of the hegemony's activities but had chosen political expediency over moral action. The human ambassador pressed his advantage. "The Galactic Council was founded on principles of justice and protection for all sentient life. When those principles are abandoned for the sake of political convenience, individual species must be prepared to act according to their own moral standards. Humanity chose to save lives rather than preserve diplomatic niceties." High Counselor Thane's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of growing agitation. "Your moral standards do not supersede galactic law, Ambassador. The hegemony demands formal apology and reparations for the destruction of their property. They are also requesting economic sanctions against all human colonies until such reparations are paid." David smiled then, an expression that somehow made the temperature in the chamber seem to drop several degrees. It was not a pleasant smile or a diplomatic one. It was the smile of someone who held cards that others had not yet seen. "Before this Council votes on sanctions," David said quietly. "I believe there is something you should know. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected unusual energy patterns emanating from the galactic core. We have been analyzing the data, and the results are quite disturbing." The chamber fell silent as David activated his personal datapad. The holographic projectors throughout the sphere responded to his signal, displaying a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy. Pulsing red indicators appeared in a tight cluster near the galactic center, their pattern suggesting something vast and purposeful stirring in the darkness between stars. "The Devourers," David said simply. "They are waking up." The effect on the assembled delegates was immediate and dramatic. Creatures that had been sitting comfortably on their platforms suddenly pressed themselves against the walls of their environmental chambers. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries began frantically exchanging communications. The very name of the devourers carried terror that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. In the chaos that followed, David remained calm at the center of the sphere. He had delivered his message, planted the seed of knowledge that would reshape every calculation and alliance in known space. The vote on sanctions suddenly seemed less important than the ancient nightmares stirring in the galactic core. The warnings had been clear for those who chose to listen. The question now was whether the galaxy would heed them before it was too late. Dr. Emma Walsh had been studying ancient ruins for most of her adult life, but nothing had prepared her for what she found drifting in the void between stars. The massive structure stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, its surface covered with symbols and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. According to her instruments, the thing was older than most civilizations, built by beings who had mastered technologies that current science could barely comprehend. The research vessel Horizon had been investigating unusual energy readings in this empty sector for 3 weeks when they stumbled across the construct. Emma's team had initially assumed they were looking at some kind of natural phenomenon, perhaps a crystallized gas cloud or an unusual asteroid formation. The truth had proven far more disturbing. "Professor, you need to see this," called Dr. Alex Torres from his position at the analysis station. The young xenorchaeologist had been working around the clock to decode the structure's purpose, and his latest findings had left him visibly shaken. "I've been comparing the energy patterns to historical records from the archive, and I think I know what we're looking at." Emma floated over to his workstation in the ship's zero-gravity environment. The display showed a complex diagram mapping energy flows throughout the ancient structure, patterns of power distribution that should have been impossible to maintain. For more than a few years had been running continuously for millennia. "It's a containment system," Alex explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "One of hundreds, maybe thousands, spread throughout the galaxy. They're all connected in a network that spans light years, working together to keep something locked away in the galactic core." Emma studied the data, her mind racing through the implications. The energy requirements for such a system would be astronomical, requiring the output of entire stars to maintain. Whatever the ancient builders had been trying to contain must have been considered an existential threat to all life in the galaxy. "How long has this been running?" she asked. "Based on the quantum decay signatures, at least 50,000 years, possibly longer." "But Professor, the containment field is weakening. The power levels have been dropping steadily for the past several centuries, and the rate of decay is accelerating." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. She had spent years studying the fragmentary records left behind by extinct civilizations, piecing together hints and legends about ancient wars and vanished enemies. Most of her colleagues had dismissed these accounts as mythology, stories told by primitive cultures to explain natural disasters they could not understand. Emma had always suspected there was more truth to the legends than anyone wanted to admit. "Contact Earth immediately," she ordered. "Priority Alpha transmission? Direct to the Department of Xenoarchaeological Research. Tell them we found proof that the Devourer legends are real and the prison is failing." The message reached Earth's Deep Space Communications Center within hours, where it was immediately forwarded to a facility that officially did not exist. Deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, the Department of Xenoarchaeological Research had been quietly preparing for this day since humanity first ventured beyond their solar system. While other species focused on exploration and trade, human researchers had been collecting every fragment of information they could find about the galaxy's dark past. Director Robert Kane read Emma's report 3 times before calling an emergency meeting of the project leaders. The conference room was filled with humanity's greatest experts in inortheology, theoretical physics, and military engineering. These were the people who had spent decades preparing for a threat that most of the galaxy refused to acknowledge existed. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears our worst fears have been confirmed," Kane announced as the holographic displays around the room activated. "Dr. Walsh's team has discovered what we believe to be one of the primary containment nodes in the ancient Barrier system. More importantly, they've confirmed that the system is failing at an exponential rate. The displays showed Emma's data alongside theoretical models and historical reconstructions. The scope of the ancient prison was staggering, encompassing technologies that current civilization could not hope to duplicate. Yet despite its incredible sophistication, the system was breaking down after millennia of operation. Time estimates. Until complete failure? Asked Dr. Lisa Park, the project's chief physicist. Between 4 and 6 months, assuming current decay rates remain constant. However, the failure is likely to cascade as individual nodes go offline and place additional strain on the remaining systems. General Harrison Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his scarred face grim with the weight of command. Status of our countermeasures? Kane manipulated the display to show a series of classified projects that had been developed in absolute secrecy over the past 60 years. Project Prometheus, a weapon system capable of generating directed energy beams that could destabilize matter at the quantum level. Project Atlas, a defensive network designed to create stable pockets of normal spacetime, surrounded by barriers that would be difficult for exotic entities to breach. And Project Thor, a last resort weapon based on technologies recovered from the deepest archaeological sites. Prometheus is 90% complete and could be deployed within weeks, Kane reported. Atlas has been under construction for years. And is ready for activation? Thor. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with discussing the final option. Thor works, but the power requirements would require us to shut down most of our outer colonies and redirect their entire energy output to the weapon systems. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Humanity would be gambling there. Entire spacefaring civilization on weapons that existed only in theory, betting everything against horrors that had driven previous galactic civilizations to extinction. What about our galactic neighbors? Asked Dr. Park. Surely they'll want to help once they understand the threat? General Marcus laughed bitterly. 3 days ago, they were voting on economic sanctions against us. They still think the biggest threat to galactic peace is human aggression. Most of them have dismissed the Devourer legends as primitive superstition. Kane nodded agreement. That may change once the barrier system starts failing more obviously. But we cannot count on assistance from species that have spent the past century trying to limit our expansion and military development. He activated another display showing intelligence reports from across known space. The hegemony was recalling military units from the frontier to protect their core worlds, though their official statements claimed it was for routine exercises. The collective had gone strangely quiet, their normally busy communication networks carrying minimal traffic. Several smaller governments were quietly negotiating mutual defense agreements, though none of them were extending offers to humanity. They know something is wrong, Dr. Park observed. Their long-range sensors must be detecting the same energy fluctuations that led Dr. Walsh to the containment node. Knowing something is wrong and being prepared to act on that knowledge are very different things, General Marcus replied. From what our intelligence services can determine, no other species has anything approaching the weapon systems we've developed. They've spent centuries building trade networks and diplomatic institutions. We've spent that time preparing for war. Kane pulled up another set of displays showing human military assets scattered throughout known space. To outside observers, humanity appeared to have a fairly standard defensive navy. Nothing particularly unusual for a young expansionist species. The reality was far different. Hidden among the civilian infrastructure were weapons platforms, shield generators, and manufacturing facilities that could produce military hardware at an unprecedented rate. The question, Kane continued, is whether we reveal our capabilities now and risk causing a panic that could destabilize galactic civilization, or wait until the threat becomes obvious and risk being too late to organize an effective defense. Dr. Park stood and walked to the main display, studying the tactical projections. If the Devourers are anything like the historical accounts suggest, panic may be the least of our concerns. These entities didn't just conquer or enslave previous civilizations. They consumed them completely, leaving nothing behind but empty space. The historical records were fragmentary and often contradictory, but certain details appeared consistently across multiple sources. Entire star systems stripped of all biological matter. Planets reduced to lifeless rocks orbiting dead. Suns. Space itself somehow damaged, creating regions where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. The Devourers had been more than just another hostile species. They had been a force of entropy made manifest, turning the galaxy's own energy against itself. General Marcus activated his personal communicator and began issuing orders to classified facilities throughout human space. All Project Prometheus assets to full readiness status. Atlas network stations to begin activation sequences. And someone get me a direct line to Admiral Chun at Fleet Command. It's time to start positioning our forces for what's coming. As the meeting dispersed and the various project leaders hurried to implement their preparations, Kane remained in the conference room studying the data from Emma's discovery. The ancient containment system had been a marvel of engineering and cooperation, built by multiple species working together to imprison a threat they could not destroy. Now that system was failing, and humanity found itself in the position of being the galaxy's last line of defense. Against horrors that most species refused to believe existed, the irony was not lost on him. For decades, other civilizations had criticized humanity's military focus and aggressive expansion policies. They had imposed trade restrictions and diplomatic sanctions, trying to force the young species to conform to their vision of civilized behavior. Now those same civilizations would depend on human weapons and human sacrifice to save them from extinction. The warnings had indeed been clear, though few had chosen to listen. The question now was whether humanity's preparations would be sufficient to face what was coming, and whether the rest of the galaxy would accept the price of survival when the ancient prison finally failed. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the observation deck of the battle station Olympus, watching construction crews make final adjustments to humanity's most ambitious project. The massive weapon platform stretched for dozens of kilometers in every direction, its surface bristling with technologies that should not have been possible according to conventional physics. After 60 years of secret development, Project Prometheus was finally ready for its ultimate test. The past month had been a whirlwind of desperate preparation and political maneuvering. News of the failing barrier system had spread throughout the galaxy despite humanity's attempts to control the information flow. 3 governments had already collapsed as their populations learned about the approaching threat. Military fleets were being recalled to defend core worlds, leaving frontier territories vulnerable and unprotected. Admiral, we're receiving another communication from the Galactic Council, reported Commander Williams from the station's communication center. High Counselor Thane is requesting immediate access to our defensive preparations. They're offering full diplomatic immunity and unlimited resource sharing in exchange for inclusion in our protection network. Chun smiled grimly. 6 weeks ago, the same council had been debating economic sanctions against humanity for their aggressive military policies. Now they were begging for protection from the consequences of their own willful ignorance. What's our official response? She asked. Ambassador Reed suggested we table the discussion until after the immediate crisis is resolved. His exact words were that we don't have time to hold their hands while the galaxy burns. The Admiral nodded approval. Reed had been transformed from diplomatic representative to military coordinator as the crisis deepened. His inside knowledge of galactic politics combined with humanity's strategic capabilities made him the ideal person to manage relationships with panicking alien governments. Status report on Atlas deployment? Chun asked. Williams consulted his displays. Network activation is proceeding ahead of schedule. 73% of planned stations are now online and maintaining stable defensive perimeters. The remaining installations should be operational within 48 hours. The Atlas network represented decades of careful planning and resource allocation. Each station was equipped with generators capable of creating localized distortions, in spacetime, effectively making protected areas unreachable to entities that existed partially outside normal physics. The technology was based on principles recovered from ancient ruins, reverse-engineered by human scientists, who had spent their careers preparing for this exact scenario. Sean activated the tactical display, showing the galaxy-wide deployment of human assets. To outside observers, it might have seemed impossible for a single species to have built such an extensive network without detection. The truth was that humanity had been preparing in plain sight, disguising military installations as civilian infrastructure and weapons platforms as research stations. "Ma'am, we're detecting massive energy discharges from the galactic core," reported Lieutenant Davis from the sensor station. "Multiple barrier nodes are showing critical failure signs simultaneously." The main display shifted to show real-time readings from the ancient containment system. Red warning indicators were spreading like an infection across the network as construct after construct reached the end of its operational life. The cascade failure that human scientists had predicted was beginning to accelerate. "Time estimate until first major breach?" Chun asked. "Based on current decay rates, approximately 6 days. However, the failure pattern suggests that once the first breach occurs, the remaining barriers will collapse much more rapidly." Chun studied the projections, her mind calculating tactical possibilities and resource requirements. Everything humanity had built over the past century was about to be tested against threats that had terrified civilizations far more advanced than any currently in existence. "Signal all Project Prometheus installations to begin final charging. Sequences, Atlas stations to maximum readiness. And someone get me a direct connection to Earth Command. It's time to implement Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was humanity's most closely guarded secret, a contingency plan that involved technologies so dangerous that even discussing them required special clearance. The weapons and defensive systems that other species knew about were impressive, enough to establish human military superiority. The ones hidden under Protocol 7 could potentially threaten the structure of reality itself. As the orders went out across human space, Joan reflected on the path that had brought them to this moment. Humanity had entered galactic civilization as newcomers eager to learn and participate in the grand community of intelligent species. They had quickly discovered that this community was built on comfortable lies and willful ignorance, with established powers more interested in maintaining their positions than addressing existential threats. The first hints about the Devourers had come from archaeological expeditions in the early days of human expansion. Ancient ruins on dead worlds contained fragmentary records about wars fought on scales that dwarfed anything in recorded history. Most xenarchaeologists had dismissed these accounts as mythology or propaganda. Human researchers had taken a different approach, assuming the worst-case scenario and planning accordingly. "Admiral, Priority 1 communication from the Hegemony Fleet Command," Williams announced. "Admiral Corvaz is requesting permission to attach his forces to our defensive perimeter." Chun raised an eyebrow. The Hegemony had been among humanity's strongest critics, constantly complaining about human military expansion and aggressive policies. Their research facility at Rigel had been the catalyst for the current diplomatic crisis. Now they were seeking protection from the very species they had been trying to constrain. Granted, she decided. Assign them to Sector 7 under Commander Rodriguez. Make sure they understand that they follow our tactical doctrine or they can defend themselves. The next few hours brought a steady stream of similar requests as alien governments realized the scope of the approaching threat. The collective offered their entire technological database in exchange for defensive coverage. 3 minor species pledged absolute loyalty to humanity in perpetuity. Even the proud sovereignty, who had never acknowledged human independence, sent discreet inquiries about mutual defense agreements. "Ma'am, sensors are detecting movement from beyond the first breach point," Davis reported, his voice tight with tension. "Multiple large entities are approaching the barrier from the other side." The tactical display updated to show massive energy signatures moving through space that should have been empty. The entities registered on sensors as impossibly large and complex, their forms shifting between dimensions in ways that made accurate measurement difficult. Scale estimates? Chun asked. The largest signatures are measuring approximately 4,000 kilometers in length. Admiral, these things are bigger than our largest space stations. Chun felt a chill despite the station's climate control. The intelligence reports had warned that the Devourers operated on scales beyond conventional understanding, but seeing the reality was still shocking. Humanity was preparing to fight enemies that were to conventional life forms what stars were to planets. Prometheus 1 through 5 are fully charged and standing by, Williams reported. All Atlas stations report ready status. Admiral, we have confirmation that Protocol 7 assets are online and awaiting authorization. Chen looked out at the stars, knowing that billions of beings throughout the galaxy were depending on decisions made in the next few minutes. Humanity had spent decades preparing for this moment while other species focused on politics and trade. Now, the young, aggressive newcomers found themselves as the galaxy's primary defenders against extinction. Open channels to all human forces, she ordered. This is Admiral Chun to all units. The barrier system is failing and hostile entities are approaching from the galactic core. As of this moment, we are officially at war with forces that threaten all life in the galaxy. Our preparations end now. Our survival begins. She paused, thinking of the colonies that would soon go dark as their power was rerouted to weapon systems. The civilians who would be evacuated to safer zones. The military personnel who would face horrors that previous generations had only imagined. 60 years ago, our ancestors decided that humanity would never again be caught unprepared by existential threats. Today we honor that commitment. The galaxy may have dismissed us as young and reckless, but they're about to learn what human determination looks like when everything we care about is at stake. The communication ended, and across human space, the greatest military machine in galactic history began its final preparations. Weapons powered by the output of entire stars charged to full capacity. Defensive networks that spanned hundreds of light years activated their reality-altering generators. And in the deepest, most classified facilities, technologies that existed at the very edge of physical possibility prepared to defend not just humanity, but the right of life itself to exist in an hostile universe. The warnings had been clear to those who chose to listen. Unfortunately, most of the galaxy had not chosen to listen until it was almost too late. Now humanity would pay the price for everyone's survival, and the rest of the galaxy would learn exactly why challenging humanity's power had been such a dangerous mistake. The first breach occurred at exactly 1432 Galactic Standard Time on what historians would later record as the day the Old Order died. Admiral Reed watched from the command center of the battle station Ragnarok as ancient technologies that had protected the galaxy for 50,000 years finally succumbed to the inevitable march of time. The barrier node, designated Alpha 7, simply stopped functioning. Its reality-stabilizing fields collapsing into quantum foam. What emerged from the breach defied every attempt at classification or description. The entity that poured through the gap in space-time existed in dimensions that human sensors could barely detect. Its form shifting between states of matter and energy in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Conservative estimates placed its length at over 4,000 kilometers, making it larger than most inhabited moons. Contact confirmed with primary hostile entity, reported Captain Martinez from her position at the tactical station. Classification impossible using standard parameters. Recommend designation as Devourer Prime. Reed nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display showing the creature's movement through normal space. Even at this distance, the entity's presence was causing distortions in local physics that made accurate sensor readings difficult to obtain. Space itself seemed to bend around the massive form, creating gravitational anomalies that should not have been possible. Status of Prometheus weapons. Array? He asked. All 5 primary installations report full charge status and target acquisition lock. Admiral, we're as ready as we'll ever be. The Prometheus weapons represented the pinnacle of human military engineering, particle beam generators capable of manipulating matter at the quantum level. Each installation required the power output of an entire star to operate, energy drawn from humanity's stellar engineering projects throughout their territory. The weapons had never been tested against a live target, but theoretical calculations suggested they could disintegrate matter more efficiently than any conventional weapon. Fire when ready, Reed ordered. The beam that lanced across space from Prometheus 1 was invisible to conventional observation, existing in frequencies beyond normal electromagnetic radiation. Its effect on Devourer Prime was immediate and dramatic. The massive entity simply ceased to exist, erased from reality as completely as if it had never been born. A cheer went up from the mixed crews aboard the defensive fleet, but Reed remained focused on the sensor displays. His celebration was premature. More entities were emerging from the breach, and these newcomers appeared to be adapting to the quantum signatures of human weapons. Admiral, the secondary hostiles are showing different energy patterns, Martinez reported. They're learning from the destruction of the primary entity. Reed was not surprised. Intelligence reports had suggested that the Devourers possessed some form of collective consciousness that allowed them to share information instantaneously across vast distances. Each weapon humanity used would become less effective as the enemy adapted to counter it. Time until they develop complete immunity to Prometheus weapons? He asked. Unknown, sir. But the energy patterns are shifting with each shot. I estimate we have perhaps 6 hours of full effectiveness remaining. Reed studied the tactical display, watching as more breaches opened throughout the barrier system. The cascade failure was accelerating, with each collapsed node placing additional strain on the remaining constructs. Within days, possibly hours, the entire prison would cease to function. Activate Atlas Protocol 7. Begin emergency power transfer to Thor charging systems. The Atlas defensive network came online across the galaxy, creating pockets of stable spacetime surrounded by barriers that existed partially outside normal physics. The technology was based on principles recovered from the ancient constructs, reverse-engineered by human scientists who had spent decades preparing for this exact scenario. As for Thor, Reed looked at the power requirements and felt the familiar weight of command. The weapon would work, but the energy cost would require shutting down every human installation outside the core systems. Entire colonies would go dark as their power was re-rated to weapons that existed at the very edge of possibility. Sir, we're receiving surrender offers from the collective government, reported Communications Officer Davis. They're requesting immediate evacuation assistance for their core populations. Reed was not surprised. The collective had been one of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilizations, but they had grown complacent over millennia of peace and prosperity. When faced with an enemy that could not be negotiated with or bribed, they had simply folded. Accepted. Route their evacuation requests through the Refugee Coordination Center. Make sure they understand that refugees follow our emergency protocols without question. Another alarm sounded across the command center. Sensors were detecting additional breaches opening simultaneously across multiple sectors. The Devourers were not emerging randomly, but according to some coordinated plan that suggested a level of strategic thinking that made them even more dangerous. Admiral, Thor weapon system reports ready status, Martinez announced. However, sir, the power requirements will be visible from half the galaxy. Every colony we shut down, every installation that goes dark, it's all going to be obvious to anyone with basic sensors. Reed nodded. There was no hiding humanity's true capabilities anymore. For decades, they had carefully maintained an image as a young, aggressive species that happened to be unusually good at fighting. The reality was far more complex. They were a species that had spent their entire spacefaring existence preparing for a war that most civilizations refused to believe would ever come. Let them see, he said finally. Let them all see what humanity built while they were playing politics. The order went out across human space, and one by one the lights began to dim. Outer colonies powered down their civilian infrastructure. As their entire energy output was rerouted to weapon systems, Mining stations that had operated for decades went silent as their fusion reactors were linked into the Thor network. Even some core world installations reduced their power output to contribute to humanity's desperate gamble. The effect was visible from across the galaxy. Human territory, which had been blazing with the energy signatures of a thriving civilization, began to show dark zones as colony after colony sacrificed their power grid for the common defense. To outside observers, it looked like humanity was systematically destroying their own infrastructure. Thor weapon system fully charged and standing by, Martinez reported. Target acquisition locked on Breach Alpha 7 and surrounding hostile entities. Fire. What emerged from the Thor installations was not energy in any conventional sense. The weapon manipulated the fundamental structure of space-time itself, creating localized regions where the normal laws of physics ceased to apply. The effect on the Devourer entities was immediate and absolute. They did not die or explode or fade away. They simply stopped existing. Along with the space they had occupied, the breach itself collapsed as reality folded in on the damaged region, creating a void that nothing could cross or inhabit. An entire section of space, hundreds of cubic light-years in volume, had been deleted from existence to prevent the Devourers from using it as a staging area. Effect confirmed, Martinez reported, her voice shaking slightly. Breach Alpha 7 has been collapsed. Hostile entities in the target zone have been eliminated. Reed allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before returning his attention to the tactical display. The victory was temporary. More breaches were opening, and the remaining Devourer entities were adapting their tactics to account for humanity's new weapons. Status of Atlas defensive grid? He asked. All stations online and maintaining stable perimeters. Refugee populations from 14 different species have been successfully relocated to protected zones. Admiral, we're receiving cooperation. Requests from governments that were demanding our surrender just weeks ago? The irony was not lost on Reed. The same civilizations that had spent decades trying to limit human military expansion were now begging for protection from the consequences of their own short-sightedness. Fear had a way of clarifying priorities that diplomacy never could. Admiral, sensors are detecting new activity from the galactic core, Davis announced. Something massive is moving behind the remaining barriers. The energy signatures are unlike anything we've encountered so far. Reed studied the long-range sensor data, noting the patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose behind the movements. The Devourers were not just awakening randomly from their ancient prison. They were organizing, preparing for a coordinated assault that would test every defense humanity had constructed. How many more breaches can we expect? He asked. Theoretical models suggest anywhere from 50 to several hundred, depending on how rapidly the remaining barrier nodes fail, Martinez replied. Sir, at current consumption rates, we can fire Thor perhaps 6 more times before our power reserves are completely exhausted. Reed calculated the odds in his head and did not like the results. Humanity had prepared for this war for 60 years, building weapons that could threaten the structure of reality itself. But even their incredible arsenal might not be sufficient to contain a threat that had required the combined efforts of multiple galactic civilizations to imprison originally. Open a channel to all human forces, he ordered. This is Admiral. Read to all units. We are now engaged in a war for the survival of all life in the galaxy. Our enemy does not seek conquest or resources. They seek the complete elimination of biological existence. There can be no negotiation, no surrender, no compromise. We fight until we win or until there is nothing left to fight for. He paused, looking around the command center at the faces of men and women who had volunteered to stand between civilization and extinction. Many of them would not survive the coming battle, but their sacrifice would determine whether life itself had a future in the galaxy. The other species called us young and reckless. They imposed sanctions and restrictions, trying to limit our military development. They never understood that we were not preparing to conquer them. We were preparing to save them. Today, we honor that commitment. Today, humanity stands guard over the galaxy. The communication ended, and across human space, the greatest military effort in recorded history continued its desperate preparations. More colonies went dark as their power was rerouted to weapon systems. Civilian populations were evacuated to fortified core worlds, while their home systems were converted into forward military bases. The entire human civilization was transforming itself into a war machine designed for a single purpose: stopping the devourers before they could consume everything that lived. Reed returned his attention to the tactical display, where new contacts were appearing near the collapsed breach zones. The devourers were learning, adapting, evolving their tactics in response to human weapons. The real war was just beginning, and its outcome would determine whether the warnings humanity had given had been heeded soon enough to matter. The galaxy had challenged humanity's power through politics and diplomacy, never realizing that human strength lay not in aggression, but in preparation. Now everyone would discover what that preparation had accomplished, and whether it would be enough to save them all from the darkness that had been waiting patiently in the galactic core for 50,000 years. 6 months after the first breach, the war was over. Admiral Reed stood in what remained of the Galactic Council chambers, looking out through cracked viewports at a galaxy that had been fundamentally changed by humanity's desperate defense against extinction. The elegant crystalline architecture bore scars from battles that had reshaped the basic laws of physics in some regions of space. The devourers were gone, destroyed or driven back into whatever realm they had emerged from. But the cost of victory had been staggering in ways that few beings could truly comprehend. Entire sectors of space had been deleted from existence to deny the enemy staging areas. 43 human colonies had been completely evacuated and their infrastructure cannibalized to power weapons that operated beyond the edge of known science. The political landscape had been equally transformed. Of the hundreds of species that had once comprised galactic civilization, barely 30 governments remained functional. The rest had collapsed during the war, their populations evacuated to human-protected zones or their territories simply abandoned when defensive resources were concentrated elsewhere. Commander Torres approached with the final casualty reports, data pads filled with numbers that Reed had already memorized. Total human military losses stand at 2.3 million personnel. Civilian casualties were minimal thanks to the evacuation protocols. Material losses include 17 major installations, 43 colony infrastructures, and approximately 60% of our stellar engineering capacity. Reed nodded grimly. The numbers were horrific by any historical standard, but they represented victory against an enemy that had driven previous galactic civilizations to complete extinction. Humanity had paid a terrible price, but they had saved not just themselves, but every other form of life in the galaxy. Status of the remaining governments? He asked. The hegemony is requesting permission to rebuild their core worlds according to human defensive standards. The collective remnants want to discuss integration into the Terran Federation. As for the Council, Torres gestured toward the handful of delegates who still occupied platforms in the damaged chamber. High Counselor Thane approached slowly, his once proud bearing now reduced to the careful movements of someone who had aged decades in a matter of months. The insectoid leader who had once threatened humanity with sanctions now looked broken and ancient. Admiral Reed, Thane said, his voice barely audible through the translation systems. The preliminary reports on your weapons deployment. Is it true that you actually succeeded in collapsing sections of space-time itself? Reed confirmed the question with a nod. 7 major collapses across 4 different sectors. Each one created a void that the devourers could not cross or consume. We essentially deleted portions of the galaxy to save the rest. The implications were staggering. Humanity had developed and deployed weapons that could erase reality itself. The technology that had saved the galaxy could also destroy it completely, and everyone knew that humans now possessed those capabilities exclusively. The old governmental structures are no longer viable, announced Counselor Vera, her scales now permanently pale with stress. The Galactic Accords were written for a universe where no single species possessed the power to threaten existence. Itself, that universe no longer exists. Reed had been expecting this conversation. The war had revealed truths about humanity's capabilities that could not be ignored or explained away. For 60 years, humans had carefully maintained an image as an aggressive but manageable young species. The reality was that they had been quietly building an arsenal capable of fighting wars on scales that older civilizations could not imagine. There will be no return to the old system, Reed stated with finality. The governmental structures that allowed this crisis to develop cannot be permitted to return. Too many beings died because your predecessors chose political convenience over acknowledging existential threats. He activated the chamber's damaged holographic display, showing a map that revealed the true scope of humanity's control over the galaxy. 67% of habitable space was now under direct Terran administration. Another 28% existed as autonomous zones under human protection. The remaining 5% consisted of dead systems, collapsed space, and regions. Still too dangerous for habitation. The transformation had not been achieved through conquest but through necessity. As the war progressed and alien governments collapsed or abandoned their territories, human forces had stepped in to maintain basic services and prevent complete chaos. Emergency powers granted during the crisis had become permanent administrative structures as the scope of reconstruction became clear. Local governance remains where possible, Reed explained to the assembled delegates. Your species retain control over internal affairs, cultural practices, and local economic systems. But strategic defense, resource allocation for reconstruction, and large-scale infrastructure development are now centralized under Terran command. The system was efficient, practical, and completely dominated by human oversight at every significant level. The species that had once tried to limit human expansion through diplomatic pressure now found themselves living under the protection of the very military machine they had attempted to constrain. Admiral long-range sensors are detecting unusual energy signatures from beyond the galactic rim, Torres reported quietly. Analysis suggests that what we faced might not have been the only concentration of devourers in the universe. Reed was not surprised by the news. The ancient records had hinted that the imprisoned entities were part of a larger phenomenon that spanned multiple galaxies. The victory they had achieved might be only the first battle in a war that could last for millennia. Then we continue building, he said, loud enough for the remaining delegates to hear. Stronger weapons, better defenses, more advanced detection systems. We prepare for whatever else might be waiting in the darkness between galaxies. He turned to face the assembled representatives, the survivors of civilizations that had learned too late the price of dismissing humanity's warnings. For decades you demanded that we limit our military development. You imposed sanctions and restrictions, trying to force us to conform to your vision of civilized behavior. You never understood that we were not building weapons to threaten. We were building them to protect you from threats you refused to acknowledge. The chamber fell silent as the full weight of that statement settled over the delegates. They had spent years trying to constrain the very capabilities that had ultimately saved them from extinction. The warnings were clear, Reed continued, using the phrase that had become humanity's unofficial motto during the war. We told you not to challenge humanity's power. Not because we were aggressive or cruel, but because when everything that matters is at stake, humans will do whatever is necessary to protect what we value. He gestured toward the scarred viewports and the construction crews visible outside, already working to rebuild and strengthen the damaged station. You challenged our power through politics and diplomacy, never realizing that our true strength lay in preparation and sacrifice. Now you live under the protection of the species you tried to limit and control. The galaxy is healing, growing stronger, preparing for whatever threats might emerge from the vast darkness beyond the stars. Reed paused, thinking of the colonies that had gone dark to power their weapons, the civilians who had been evacuated to safety, the soldiers who had died fighting horrors that previous generations had dismissed as mythology. Humanity never wanted to rule the galaxy. We wanted to survive in it. But survival required capabilities that you found threatening, and protection required sacrifices that you were unwilling to make. So we made those sacrifices for you, paid the price for everyone's continued existence. The reconstruction continued. Outside the chamber, human engineers working alongside alien specialists to build something new from the ruins of the old order. The galaxy was indeed healing, but it was healing under the guidance and protection of the species that had been prepared for the unthinkable. The warnings had been clear, and now everyone understood why challenging humanity's power had been such a dangerous mistake. The young, aggressive newcomers had become the guardians of all life in the galaxy, carrying a responsibility they had never sought but would never abandon. And in the darkness beyond the galactic rim, other threats waited and watched, perhaps planning their own challenges to the power that humanity had so reluctantly but thoroughly claimed.